Good evening. This is Jacob Hornberger, and this is my weekly internet show. Nice to be back with you all. Trust you had a Merry Christmas, and of course, wish you a Happy New Year. Well, I think the members of Congress are over there in this late night, panicky, desperate session to save America from falling off the fiscal cliff. And what a joke! I mean, this whole thing is a joke. Well, for one thing, look how they've always got these crises going on. That's the nature of the welfare warfare state. The system under which we live, the socialist, imperialist, interventionist system. There's always a crisis. Everybody's always supposed to be all hyped up. I'm surprised they don't have color codes. Hey, we're on red alert for the fiscal cliff. Everybody, get your parachutes on because we're going to have to float down to the bottom. And I mean, what a friggin' joke, the whole shebang. Let me talk to you a little bit. I know we've talked about this in the past, but it bears emphasizing about what is really going on here with the fiscal policy and the economic policy, because they're saying, oh, this is going to throw us into this deep recession, and it's Y2K all over again, and panic, desperation, fear. Fear is the coin of the realm. We see it in the warfare state, right? Where the terrorists are coming to get us, or the communists are coming to get us, or the illegal aliens, or the drug dealers, and we're all supposed to be in this constant state of fear, which means ever increasing government budgets, to keep us safe. You see, send more troops overseas because they're defending our rights and freedoms and keeping us safe. Well, you see it over here on the economic side too. We're getting a taste of it now. Oh my gosh, the fiscal cliff. Remember when they were bailing out their buddies on Wall Street? Oh, if we don't do this, it'll be catastrophic. Oh, the economy will never recover. Oh my gosh, we might as well just, all just go home. What a joke, right? Here's the situation. Before all this got going, the welfare warfare state, Americans lived under a completely different kind of system. If you take, for example, the late 1800s, there was no income tax, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no systems of public schooling, no drug laws, no immigration controls, no economic regulations to speak of. Sherman Antitrust Act and a few maybe at the state and local level. But they didn't have the SEC and the FDA and all these other regulatory agencies that are supposedly to keep us safe. And so, government was very limited because there was no income tax either. Imagine that. And no Federal Reserve. The official money of the country was gold and silver coins. And the reason that our ancestors had established gold and silver coins was to ensure that the government would never be able to inflate. And that's the cause of inflation. It's when government inflates the currency by printing a lot of it. Well, so our ancestor says, this is one country where that's not going to happen because gold and silver coins are going to be the official medium of exchange. Well, in the 20th century, as you know, there was a tremendous battle. It began in the late 1900s, but into the early 20th century, the tremendous battle between the statists and really the libertarians. And the statists, they must have been despondent and depressed. Imagine the odds against them. Here was a country that didn't have this socialism and no standing army, no overseas military bases, no CIA, no military industrial complex, no warfare state. And here the statists come in and say, oh, we need all of this statism. We need Social Security and national health care, the socialist ideal that was sweeping the world, bringing it into the United States through the progressive movement. And then, of course, you've got the imperialist aspect, where the U.S. government abandoned its role as a constitutionally limited republic and became this vast military empire, invading, occupying, sanctioning, embargoing, assassinating, torturing, what have you. Well, obviously, to do all these things, you need more tax revenues because, as I've pointed out in the past, the only place the government has to get its money is by confiscating it, by taking it from the wealth-producing sector. That's why when these people, the statists right now in all this panicky, oh my gosh, the fiscal cliff, where they're saying, oh, it's going to hurt the economy, it's going to hurt the economy, that really they're talking from the mindset of a statist who has put into place over many decades, the statists and their predecessors, this gigantic welfare warfare state. It's like a cancer. I mean, it's attached on to the body politic. It's killing the body politic, and they don't want to remove this cancer. They want to figure out ways to feed the cancer. So here's what happens. You see, they decide, well, we're going to get a welfare state, and they got it. I mean, that's what Franklin Roosevelt's revolution was, and it was a revolution. I mean, they didn't get a constitutional amendment to establish a new economic system. They just did it by decree, and they decreed that it would be a welfare state. Now, they didn't call it that. They said, oh, we're saving free enterprise with our welfare state. You see, so that way Americans could feel good and say, oh, we still have a free enterprise system. Thank goodness we're not socialists. Oh my gosh, we're so happy. Well, but they were embracing socialism, just like the rest of the world. I mean, the whole welfare state, taking from those who have in order to give to those that don't have, or to whom it doesn't belong. The old Marxian concept, from each according to ability to each according to need. And Social Security was the big one, the first one. You take money from the young and the productive in order to give to the seniors. And those seniors couldn't say, we put it in, we got a right to take it back, right? Go ahead and put anything in, because the program was just adopted at that time. And Roosevelt knew what he was doing. Once he puts people on this dole, that's it. He knows that those are going to be people that are going to be dependent on the government. They're not going to want to shake things up. They're not going to criticize the government too heavily, because the government could cut off their dole. It's like a parent and a child. Well, when you've got these expenditures that are now starting to mount, foreign aid to dictators and farm subsidies and aid to education and SBA loans and, drug enforcement agent salaries. Well, then you need tax revenues, okay? Well, that's where the income tax comes in. They say, oh, okay, it's only going to be on the rich. That's what they said. We promise you it's only going to be a small percentage on the rich. What they were really doing was employing the sins of envy and covetousness, because what they were, and they still do it today. I mean, it's like, people focusing on why do they have more when I don't have as much as they do, and I mean, that is what coveting is all about. That's what the commandment is designed to, tell people don't do. It's not healthy. It's destructive. It's morally destructive. It's spiritually destructive. But that's the whole idea of the progressive income tax. Take from him more because he's richer than I am. And so as they start accumulating this massive amount of money through the income tax, which was imposed in 1913, at least the 16th Amendment, which justified a whole array of income taxes, comes into play. And then they got the Federal Reserve in the same year, interestingly enough. And so, they start bringing in this money with an income tax. Well, theoretically, they could just be spending that same amount of money. I mean, let's say that they're collecting $1 million in taxes. They put $1 million out in the dole and the military, and so it's equal. Okay, you bring in $1 million, you spend $1 million. Well, what ends up happening though is they figure out that if they put more people on the dole, then that inures to their benefit, the incumbent, the giant government machine that doesn't want to go out of business. All these bureaucracies that are coming into play. The Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, HUD, Health and Human Services. I mean, those bureaucracies, they feel like they're entitled to exist permanently, and so they figure, well, if we put more people on the dole, no one's going to shake things up because we'll just threaten to cut off their dole. And you can see them doing it. If you don't give us this tax increase or this deal, well, the first thing we're going to cut is the things most important to you. And so what they end up doing is they end up spending more money. Now they could, impose higher taxes to cover that additional expenditure, but the problem is they get to a point where the taxpayers start to revolt. They get angry. What do you mean you're raising our taxes? And so that doesn't stop them from continuing to spend, because remember, they want to put, the more people they got on the dole, the more the nation becomes soft and compliant and submissive and obedient and praise the troops, thank the troops, oh, whatever the troops do, we love you, we love you, kill, we don't care how many people you kill with your drone assassinations, it must be right, we're not going to question it, thank you for your service. Well, yeah, because, you know, if you don't, if you start thinking independently and whatever, the government may say, you know, we're thinking about repealing your Medicare program. Oh, no, no, no. Okay, wait. We take it all back. We're sorry. So they were spending over decades more and more and more money in excess of the amount of taxes they were collecting. Now, how do they do this? Well, they just go out and borrow the difference. Okay? And so that borrowing then becomes part of the government's debt. And notice that the status, you know, it's very amusing. I saw one op-ed over the weekend. I forget which paper it was in, but it's one of the big papers, where the guy says, "Oh well, the debt is reflects, you know, what we owe as a country." And all this is such nonsense. I mean, there is the country and there is the government. Okay, I mean that fact is implicit in the Bill of Rights, which expressly protects the country from the government. And so you've got the government that's mounting this massive amount of debt because it just keeps spending more than what it brings in taxes. And it does this year after year, decade after decade. Well, as Milton Friedman has said, the real level of taxes is not the amount of taxes they're bringing in. The real level of taxes is how much the government is spending. I mean, doesn't that make sense? Because they're still sucking that money out of people's pockets, you know, whether it's in the form of a tax confiscation or in the form of a borrowing that it's doing. It's taking money out of the private sector. So you've got two sectors. You've got the government sector, which we might call the parasitic sector, because it can only thrive by confiscating wealth that's produced by the private sector. And then you've got the private sector, the sector that produces the wealth. So, you know, what's the key to economic prosperity, to high standards of living and so forth? Well, you know, Adam Smith gave the hint, you know, as long ago as 1776 in his massive treatise, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. The nations where people have higher standards of living are ones where the private sector is accumulating much larger amounts of wealth. To the extent that the private sector is free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, to that extent, everybody in that society has a higher standard of living, even those who take vows of poverty. I mean, notice that a Catholic nun here in the United States lives a much better lifestyle, who takes a vow of poverty, as compared to her counterpart in Guatemala. Okay? I mean, that's because of the enormous spreading out effects of a rising standard of living. So they're borrowing this money, they're sucking it out of the private sector. It's just as bad as if they were taxing it. Oh, and by the way, they have to pay it back, right? So that means taxes in the future. So this is a huge burden. And now, what's the problem here? Well, as people start noticing, they start saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a deficit. The government is spending a lot more than what it's bringing in. Now, what's the fundamental problem, though? Well, what the statists have done, and it's very clever what they've done, and it's very effective, because, you know, they're dealing with, you know, your average public school graduate. He's learned not to think. He's learned to memorize. He's learned to regurgitate. He doesn't have a critical mind. I'm talking about the non-libertarians. I mean, libertarians have broken free of the public school, you know, mindset that they, you know, the regimentation, the molding that they do in people's minds over that 12-year period. But most people haven't broken free of that. And so so the statists take advantage of that, and they say, the problem, we have a huge problem in this country. We have a problem with a budget deficit. Oh my gosh, the deficit is a real danger to America, and we've got to do something about the deficit. Now notice what they're saying. They're focusing on the difference, the massive difference between what the government is spending and what the government is bringing in. Now, why is that clever, and why is that important? Well, because if the deficit's the problem then the solution for the statist is obvious. We got to raise taxes to eliminate the deficit. You see, so if taxes are at $1 million total, just hypothetically speaking, and spending is at $3 million, and we've got a budget deficit problem, and we've got to just raise taxes by another $2 million. Or let's compromise. Let's lower spending by $1 million and raise taxes by $1 million and balance the budget. Do you see the failure and the fallacy of that type of thinking? The problem isn't the deficit. The problem is the government spending too much. It should never have gone past the $1 million that it had in tax revenues. That's the problem. Okay? And so what's the solution? The solution, of course, is for the government to just eliminate the spending to the tune of $2 million. Getting back to the original tax revenue level. Now, of course, that's not good enough for us libertarians because we don't just talk in terms of cutting government spending like conservatives do. We talk about what is the role of government in a free society. And so we'd start dismantling programs. So we'd dismantle, Medicare, Social Security, aid to dictatorships, aid to democracies, farm subsidies, education grants. We'd eliminate every single program where the government takes money from taxpayers and doles it out to other people. That's not a legitimate function of government. That was never designed to be one of the powers of the federal government. You search in vain in the Constitution for a grant of such power. It doesn't exist. And because our founding fathers, they wanted nothing to do with socialism. Okay, I mean that was not the kind of America that they wanted. So that's the problem, is the government's doing all of these things, including the warfare state too. I don't mean to just harp on the welfare part of this thing. I mean, you've got the gigantic empire, all those bases, overseas bases, the golf courses, the nice jet planes for the generals, the $1 million toilets, the invasions, the occupations, please keep us safe, all that nonsense. I mean, that's all costing money too. But the problem is the spending. And that's what they won't acknowledge. Now, by putting a huge amount of resources into federal spending, what they do is they make a lot of people dependent on the dole. And I'm not talking about just direct, receive a dole. I'm talking about all the contractors and the subcontractors. I mean, you look at the military. I mean, it is impossible to overstate the extensive role that the military plays in America. In the economy, and it's incredible. We are a militarized society. I mean, it's like a cancer that just goes all throughout society. And if the military, says, well, we're going to close this base, man, everybody goes ballistic because they've been very clever and they spread it out among many states, all the tanks and the weaponry and the airplanes. And just think, you got all the soft drink purveyors, you've got the people clothing, uniforms and so forth. You've got all the food and the PXs and so forth. I mean, it's impossible to really estimate how extensive the role of the military and the military-industrial complex and the CIA is in American life. We don't even know what the CIA's budget is because we're not permitted to. Cold War ended. That was why the CIA was established, and but that didn't stop the CIA because ultimately the CIA has become, and the military have essentially become a fourth branch of government. I mean, nobody's going to touch them. Okay, nobody's going to touch them. Not the courts. I mean, we've seen that. And certainly not Congress. And, of course, the president's not going to do anything. I mean, there really hasn't been a president challenging the military, the standing army, the CIA, really since Kennedy. And there hasn't been a president warning about how the military and military-industrial complex is a threat to our democratic processes since Eisenhower. And there hasn't been a president that's warned about how the CIA has become a sinister force, a dark and sinister force in American life since Truman. And that was back in 1963. Nobody's going to buck these guys. And so you've got this extensive permanent establishment in America that's spending it out the gazoo. And so, they've got this huge, huge cancer consisting of this parasitic sector in society. So when they talk about, a cut in federal spending and they're saying we'll have to lay off, workers, they call that a recession. You see that the fact that federal employees, far be it for me to call them non-essential. Remember several years ago when they were sending all the non-essential workers home, and they got all upset and their self-esteem was hurt, and they said, "Okay, we'll never again call you non-essential, and we won't hurt your feelings that way." Well, as far as I'm concerned, they're all non-essential. Because they're part of the welfare warfare state, which is non-essential, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. That we don't need a welfare warfare state. It's what's destroying our country. So when they say, oh, well, if we cut back on this program, it's going to hurt the economy, what they're saying is it's going to hurt America to have the parasitic sector reduced a bit. Now, that's ridiculous, because it's the parasitic sector that is destroying the wealth-producing sector. In other words, let's say you cut the parasitic sector by 50%. Okay, you lay off, bring all the troops home and you just lay them off. Okay, all the federal welfare bureaucracies, just lay them off. They would say, well, that's a recession because you've got now all this unemployment. That's ridiculous. I mean, remember when all the troops came home from World War II and they were saying the same thing? Oh, no, we can't lay off the troops because that'll be a recession. They'll be unemployed. Well, the exact opposite happens. That now you don't have the wealth-producing sector suffering the burden of having its wealth confiscated to fund all these people. You see, now they can keep the wealth in the private sector. That's the key to higher standards of living. But it's a doubly positive effect that all these people in the parasitic sector are now in the private sector, producing wealth too. And where do the opportunities for them to work come from? From the fact that everybody's got his money again. It's not being confiscated. So all of a sudden, man, think about it. Let's say that we libertarians had won out 20 years ago with abolishing the income tax, which is what we've been calling for umpteen years. Think how much you've paid in income taxes, or how much you pay this year. Let's say it's $30,000 a year. You keep that $30,000 or whatever the percentage is that's needed to support the parasitic sector that they reduce it by. You're going to do a lot of things with that money. You may invest it, which increases money in the financial services sector or jobs in the financial services sector. You may go on vacation. You may buy a new car. This is what creates the dynamics that then offer opportunities for the people that were formerly in the parasitic sector. But what's important is that they're now producing too. So it's a doubly positive effect. It's not a disaster when you slash the parasitic federal sector. I mean, the Cubans are going through this right now. I mean, they employ about 98% of the people in the public sector, and that's why they verged on starvation for decades, not just because of the U.S. embargo. Yeah, that plays a role, no question about it. But I mean, look at North Korea, same thing. When the state plays this dominant role in the society, whether it's the military, like here in the United States, or the welfare state, like in North Korea, well, here too, when the whole government plays this dominant role, that's a horrendous thing for people. I mean, economically, it's the worst thing that can happen. I mean, look at the Greek people. I mean, their government's broke now, and that's where this government's heading this country, the federal government. And so the best thing we could ever do is dismantle this thing. Does that mean that all of these people lose their jobs? Yeah, sure does. But it also means that those in the private sector be able to keep their wealth, and that's the key to higher standards of living. Now, this fiscal cliff, the worst part of this deal is the tax increases. But you know what? It doesn't really matter anyway, because as long as the spending is exceeding the tax revenues, remember what Friedman said, that's the real level of taxation. And so whether they strike a deal on the taxes or not, I mean, the best thing they could do is lower the taxes, but it's still not going to make any difference from a practical standpoint, because the real level of taxes is what they're spending. So we really have got to talk about slashing the spending. And that's where we libertarians say, well, let's go further than that. Let's talk about what the role of government in a free society is. And that's why we'd get rid of this huge military-industrial complex, the warfare state, the overseas bases, the invasions, the occupations, the torture. I mean, the national security state is really one of the twin cancers that's taking this country down. And we don't need it. You see, that's the thing. They try to tell us, oh, if we didn't exist, if the CIA didn't exist, which, remember, was brought into existence to fight a Cold War against America's World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union. And that war ended a long time ago. But they tell us, oh, if the CIA didn't exist, we would be invaded by terrorists. And well, the terrorists are produced, at least in an anti-American sense, because of what the military and the CIA are doing overseas. You know, I mean, it's like they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. They go and create the problems, and then they say, well, okay, well, we're going to here protect you from the problems we've created. Well, how about not even existing so that you can't create the problems? I mean, look at the Swiss people. Do they live in fear of terrorism? Do they live in fear of Muslims? Do they, have these color codes and hyperactivity and bases overseas and invasions and occupations? No, they are truly a nation oriented toward defense. Everybody's got an assault rifle in his house. He's got automatic weapons. There's no mass murderers. It's a functional society. Now, there's compulsion in there. You know, the draft, they draft young men to serve 10 years or so. But you could do without that and still have people be in essentially the militia, you know, ready to come forward and serve in the event of an invasion. But theirs is truly defense, unlike this, Department of Defense over here that, has all these bases overseas and invading countries and affecting regime change operations and supporting dictatorships. Now is our opportunity. The statists are finally admitting that Afghanistan's turned out to be as big a fiasco as Iraq. Now as they're pulling out, the military is shifting and saying, well, we need to move over toward China and see if we can cause some problems over there. We need some kind of fear factor here. And they're going to need a new fear factor. I don't know what that's going to be, but they need a new fear factor. They're ginning up on the war on drugs like they did after the Cold War ended and before 9/11. They're looking around for a mission, and this is our opportunity to get Americans to challenge the entire existence of the national security state. Cold War is over. It's time to dismantle this thing. It is a cancerous burden on society, and we got to do the same thing with the welfare state. Charity has nothing to do with government. And that's the trouble with the progressives, the liberals. They think that it's entirely proper for government to force people to be good, to force people to be caring and compassionate. You can't force people to be good, caring, and compassionate. All you can do is steal their money or force them into helping somebody else on pain of going to jail if they refuse. That's not charity, and that's not freedom of choice. That's just coercion, compulsion, stealing, theft, covetousness, envy. And look at the kind of society it's produced. I mean, a society where you have massive amounts of people on drugs, tripping out on drugs. I mean, at least massive enough that they feel like they have to continue this decades-long failed, immoral, and destructive war on drugs. And remember that most of these drug users went into public schools. I mean, they had them for 12 years. And I think it's time that we maybe start asking the question, is some of the dysfunctionality in life among certain citizens a direct consequence of the coercion, the initiation of force that was employed against them as part of this huge system of coercion and compulsion in which we live? And the statists never want to ask that question because the statists don't want you to challenge their system itself. They want you to talk about how can we fix what's going on within this system? Can we have gun control? Can we have stricter gun laws and drug laws and more regulation? And you see, it's never a problem of their welfare warfare state paradigm or framework. It's that there's always too much freedom. And so that's where we libertarians come in. We're the hope for this thing. We provide not ways to reform this dysfunctional system. We provide the alternative, the genuine alternative, of an unhampered market economy where people are free to decide what to do with their own money, where people are free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, where they're free to let the free market determine the medium of exchange, gold and silver or whatever, where there is no Federal Reserve to plunder and loot the people, IRS the same, DEA, the whole kit and caboodle. As you may know, this is our end-of-year fundraising drive. We truly need your support. We depend on your support. We're like any other nonprofit educational foundation. What we do, with our articles and our conferences and our speeches and our programs, depends on your support. And we're very, very grateful. If you've already sent an end-of-year donation, thank you very much. If you haven't, you still got a couple of days to get that tax deduction in for this year, and we'd be very, very grateful for your support. And thank you for listening to this program, and thank you for your dedication to liberty and your support of the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're very, very grateful, and we want to wish you all a very happy New Year, and maybe a very free New Year. Thanks so much.